Good day everyone, and welcome to Deltascape version 3 Savage, where we'll be reenacting our battle against the mistress of games, Halicarnassus. This encounter can be split into 5 unique phases, each containing a panel theme, and culminating with a final swap that combines tiles from all previous phases. This mechanic ties into one of Halicarnassus' core abilities, the Queen's Waltz, which behaves differently depending on which tile she's standing on when she casts it. We'll be covering each variation in their respective phase. However, most of our other mechanics remain consistent throughout the fight, so let's have a look at them first. For starters, we have Critical Hit, a hard-hitting, single-target tank buster that, much like the name implies, will always critically hit. Invulnerabilities aside, Critical Hit can be mitigated by combining Awareness with a weaker cooldown, such as Rampart, or a stronger one on its own, such as Sentinel, Vengeance, or Shadow Wall. Be mindful that critical hits cannot be blocked nor parried, so actions such as Sheltron and Raw Intuition will not provide any mitigation unless they are also paired with Awareness. Next we have Spellblade Holy. This ability targets 4 random players, 1 with a stack marker and 3 others with circle markers, and pairs them together. After a brief delay, these players will swap positions with their respective partners, and the resulting damage will be registered. To account for the position shift, the stack marker must be moved away from the rest of the party, while its tethered partner stacks with the other unmarked players near the boss. Dimensional Wave is a raid-wide attack that carries over from normal mode, but occurs much more frequently and deals significantly more damage. In addition to regular healer mitigation, casters can further reduce its damage with the roll action Addle, while tanks can also contribute with the roll action Reprisal. The ability Haste will empower Halicarnassus with a brief action speed buff, causing her to execute abilities noticeably faster for the next few seconds. While Haste is in effect, she will normally cast one of 3 possible spells: Fire, a donut-shaped AoE, Blizzard, a point-blank AoE, or Thunder, a line-shaped AoE. Players should position themselves in such a way that any of those 3 spells can be dodged at a moment's notice, not too close to the boss, but also not too far. The only exception to this rule occurs during the final phase, where Halicarnassus can and will execute multiple spells in succession. The last mechanic to keep in mind for now is Mind Jack. Upon execution, players will become afflicted with Forced March, causing them to move in a specific direction once the debuff wears off. While Mind Jack may sound harmless on its own, it is often used in combination with other mechanics, forcing players to plan their escape route in advance. To facilitate this, players can simply point the direction of their debuff icon towards their desired destination, relative to the direction your character is currently facing. In addition, Sprint can also be activated beforehand to increase the distance traveled during the Forced March. Now, before we begin, it's important to assign positions for many of Halicarnassus' mechanics, and to assist with this, it's helpful to set up markers near each corner of the arena. Firstly, cardinal directions, or clock positions, with the main tank normally starting at north. And secondly, tile positions. In this case, it's preferable to have tanks and melee DPS closer to the center, while healers and ranged DPS remain farther along the edges. Now then, with all that information in mind, let's have a closer look at how it all comes together. Phase 1 begins with Halicarnassus performing Critical Hit on the main tank, followed by Spellblade Holy, the position shift mechanic. Shortly after, the first iteration of the Queen's Waltz will be executed, which, when performed over the neutral tiles of Phase 1, will result in narrow lines being fired toward each player. To avoid overlapping damage, players should utilize their assigned clock positions. Be mindful, however, that the boss may not always be facing north when using this ability, so rotate your assigned spots accordingly. At this point, Halicarnassus will empower herself with Haste, indicating an upcoming random spell, Fire, Blizzard, or Thunder, followed by a raid-wide Dimensional Wave. The last mechanic of Phase 1 comes in the form of the Playing Field, where 6 role-specific tiles will be summoned across the arena. Before heading to their respective tiles, however, all party members should stack together to avoid being transformed into pigs by Oink. It's worth reiterating that while transformed, players will not be eligible for any role-specific tiles, and that every tile needs to be occupied by at least one player in Savage mode. As we enter Phase 2, Halicarnassus will shift the arena into a diagonal line of grassy tiles and thorny panels. The orientation of such tiles is always random, so the first thing to identify upon entering this phase are what corners of the arena are safe to use. After a brief delay, Halicarnassus will execute the second variation of the Queen's Waltz, which, when performed over the grassy tiles of Phase 2, will tether tanks and healers to each DPS. Much like typical tether mechanics, the party should first stack near the boss as they are formed, and travel to their respective corners in order to break them. For tanks and healers, this is normally whichever north corner is safe to use, and for DPS, the south counterpart. After executing Haste, Critical Hit, and Dimensional Wave, Halicarnassus will summon a targetable enemy, the White Flame, which should be taken to the southern corner of the room by the off-tank and eliminated as quickly as possible. At the same time, the main tank should isolate Halicarnassus in the northern corner of the arena, as the White Flame will restore a significant portion of her health if they are kept close to each other. After a moderate delay, Halicarnassus will execute Mindjack, the Forced March mechanic, and pair it with the Queen's Waltz, once again tethering all players together. As mentioned before, players should orient themselves in such a way that Mindjack will automatically take them to their respective corners and break their tethers. Following one more dimensional wave, the fight will proceed to the next panel swap. Phase 3 begins with the arena shifting into a cave theme, much like in normal mode, with a few key differences. Upon panel swapping, Halicarnassus will summon a Cleaving Dragon, which must be quickly picked up by the off-tank and positioned in such a way that its Frost Breath is pointed away from the rest of the party, but remains within reach for dealing damage. Positioning here is tricky, as players will want to stay within the safe blue tiles for the next variation of the Queen's Waltz, which, when performed over the cave tile set, will cause eruptions on all non-blue tiles. Shortly after, Halicarnassus will target a random player with Ribbit. It's important to keep a sharp eye on her cast bar and identify which direction she is facing, as, just like in normal mode, Ribbit is not a telegraphed attack. Upon weaving Dimensional Wave and Critical Hit into her rotation, Halicarnassus will summon untargetable Reapers in a random formation around the arena with Place Dark token. After a moderate delay, these will rush through in straight lines, leaving only one of the blue tiles as a safe spot. Players must quickly identify it by looking at the Reaper formation, and wait until the mechanic resolves. At this point, Halicarnassus will proceed to repeat Haste and Dimensional Wave, both abilities we've already seen, before executing the next panel swap. Upon entering Phase 4, a new set of tiles will be introduced, the Library, as well as several open books along the edges of the arena that should be left alone for now. Shortly after panel swapping, Halicarnassus will execute a new variation of the Queen's Waltz, which, when performed over the library tile set, will drop a large book on each player's tile. Players should utilize their respective tile positions for this mechanic, as having more than one player in any tile during the Queen's Waltz will result in casualties. After stacking together to avoid being turned into pigs by another Oink, Halicarnassus will summon a new enemy, the A-Panda, which should be picked up by the off-tank and focused down as quickly as possible. At the same time, Halicarnassus will once again begin casting the Queen's Waltz, but this time combined with the Magical Hammer, a large circle AoE that targets all players. Positioning here is particularly tricky. The 4 players assigned to the central tiles should bait the Magical Hammer towards the center of the arena, while the 4 players in the outermost tiles bait theirs towards the outer edges, all while remaining inside their respective tiles. After all is said and done, be sure to bring your attention back to the A-Panda, but be wary of Squelch, a look-away mechanic that occurs around the same time. The main tank should also be mindful of the rogue critical hit that happens shortly after. Once the A-Panda has been dealt with, it's finally time to put the open books to use for the upcoming Spellblade Holy. During the library phase, this mechanic will not shift players, but instead mark 4 players with circle AoEs, 2 players with stacking markers, and leave 2 with none. The 4 players marked with circle AoEs must claim 1 green book each, granting them a temporary buff that allows them to survive the attack. Each stack marker must pair with an unmarked player, claim their respective blue books, and stand on separate tiles, all while being close enough to each other to split the damage taken. After Spellblade Holy resolves, it is strongly recommended to perform a melee limit break, as there will be a moderate delay before Halicarnassus takes us to the final phase. Phase 5 begins with a panel swap that recreates tiles from all previous phases, and repeats many of the same mechanics we've already seen and learned. And with that in mind, we'll be focusing on the new and particularly dangerous mechanics. Firstly, we have the animal-based playing field. In this iteration of the game, Halicarnassus will execute all previous transformation abilities, Ribbit, Squelch, and Oink, in a random order, and players must intentionally transform themselves to match tile requirements. This mechanic can be cleared relatively easily, however, by having healers fail the first mechanic, followed by the tanks, and lastly the DPS. This will ensure the highest possible damage dealing uptime, and resolve the tile matching requirement. Each role should only fail their respective transformation mechanic, and should the puzzle be solved to satisfaction, Halicarnassus will award the party with a full limit break bar. Up next, Halicarnassus will jump to a random tile and perform the Queen's Waltz. Depending on which tile she's standing on, this ability will perform differently, just like we've learned in previous phases. Line AoEs in neutral tiles, tethers in grassy tiles, eruptions in blue tiles, and books in library tiles. While Spellblade Holy and Critical Hit perform identically to the first phase, Mindjack will now be paired with untargetable Reapers and proximity damage markers on 4 players. The trick here is to position yourself in such a way that Forced March will